have processes, right? How we get things done. Somebody asked me, what's your process? And it's a tough question because I don't always know. But one of the things I do know is there's a difference between, I've mentioned it from time to time, the sermon I get early in the week and the one I preach. And one of the things in life that we have to learn to do is get past sometimes it feels like the outpouring of the Holy Spirit and get to what the Holy Spirit is simply communicating to us and what it wants us to communicate to other people. Because those aren't always the same. They don't always come across the same. And so what I said was part of my process that I do have a handle on is what I get early in the week may or may not be from the Holy Spirit, but it definitely comes through the lens of whatever it is I'm going through. And if I'm reading the Bible through the lens of my frustration, I don't need to preach it to you that way. So that's just me being honest about me hopefully using this seat to tone down my approach. Once again, in a set of Proverbs that have a lot of wisdom in them, but can be preached a really harsh way. And so I don't want my week to affect your week going forward. I want my past to stay in the past, and hopefully the good things that Solomon has to give us will encourage you as you move on through this week. As we look at this concept of our own hands, comes from the very first verse of Proverbs 14:1. Proverbs 14:1, which says, "The wisest of women builds her house, but folly with her own hands tears it down." The first thing to notice is, once again, this is not exclusively talking about women who either build or tear down their homes. Understanding, we talked last week about the concept of wisdom and folly being personified in a woman, who really goes back to the creation when it talks about wisdom being there before we ever were, being there as we were being created, joyous with God, and which means mutuality. I got it stated out of order, which means wisdom wasn't just happy to be there in his presence at our creation, but God was there joyous with wisdom personified as a woman. But as we saw it, it's not simply wisdom that's personified as a woman, it is folly as well. And once again, we're seeing that distinction here in 14:1. So even though it literally says the wisest of women builds her house, but folly with her own hands tears it down, understand, fellas, it takes two. You've heard it before, right? And so ultimately, these are words that are speaking to us as well. Why? Because if you turn back to chapter 12, one of our sisters, when we first went into Proverbs, I kind of just asked at random, what's your favorite proverb or what catches your attention? And this is, I think, the first one that came to mind in the young adults class. And it was one of those that I don't talk about that one because, yeah, I could talk about it way too much. But Proverbs 12:1 says, "Whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but he who hates reproof is," what does your translation say? So those are because there's a fine line, because by the time you get to the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is saying you gotta be careful about the way you talk about a brother or sister, right? So even in times when I'm quoting scripture, I gotta be careful of the tone because I can say the right thing the wrong way and completely ruin the message. But there's a lot of wisdom in that. Why? Because we're talking about that whole concept of the wise build their homes while the foolish tear them down with their own hands. The thing that really came to mind most for me is we are in a nation that prides itself on the pursuit of happiness. And that's not a bad thing. The Bible isn't about reaching a morbid conclusion, living our entire lives of toil, only go to heaven to reach more toil. No. It's about happy endings. But the question is, are we reaching happy endings in a way that is ultimately self-destructive? And so I don't think the Proverbs come quite as well as they do from a man who's super successful. See, Solomon's not writing as a failed king. He's writing as quite possibly the richest king of Israel. And as the richest king of Israel, once again, he's saying there are two ways we can build. And ultimately, he's saying these are the things that have provided sustained peace in those times when the 1,000 women didn't catch up to me. If I had to go back and rebuild again, these are the kinds of things that would have allowed me to pursue happiness in a way that would endure. Why? Because there are 5 things. I'm calling the short lessons this week the sauce. I mentioned to the young people, Texas, we barbecue. I marinate a little bit. And there's some basic principles of some recipes. Y'all cook probably more than I do. We got potluck Sunday here, so correct me if I'm wrong. Fix this. For those of you who know cooking way better than I do. But I got 3 basic things that go into any rub I'm doing, whether it's beef, fish, chicken, whatever. And it's salt, go figure, right? It's garlic for me, and it's onions. They're pretty much always there. But see, not everybody likes onions. And so sometimes I will de-emphasize one ingredient and emphasize another, even if I don't leave it out altogether. And so in the Proverbs, that's what we see Solomon doing. There's some basic things we can try to build our success without, but he's saying, for me, this is what worked. And his salt seemed to be righteousness as opposed to wickedness. It sounds basic. It sounds stale to us. And so we find ourselves on the short end of a deal, right? We talk about it from time to time. And so his salt seems to be this whole contrast that you see. A lot of these proverbs are going to be the righteous do this, but the wicked do this. The righteous do this, but the wicked do this. And most of these proverbs I've come to so far, the righteous wicked parallel is going to be there at least 10 times in a proverb that may run 20 or 30 verses. That's 30, was it 10, 30% of the proverbs is devoted to that. Then down from that, maybe the garlic would be the wisdom versus the folly. He's literally going to bring that word up quite a bit in some of these proverbs, but the rest of it's just going to be wise counsel. A lot of times it's going to flip. Sometimes it'll be the more than 10. Sometimes it'll be just under 10. Maybe about 9 times that'll come up in some of these proverbs. Once again, that's still pushing 30% of a lot of these compare and contrast proverbs. And then you have some variables that may replace the onions or the onion powder. If you're like me, you don't have time to, you just aren't patient enough to deal with a whole lot of onions. And those can be the way, how am I speaking? How do I use my tongue? And so when I picked a verse for this morning, it didn't have a whole lot to do. I'm not picking proverbs that are necessarily coming out of the lesson, but sometimes I need the counseling before I get up to speak, like I mentioned. I need a proverb that's going to warn me about the way that I speak before I say a word. And so that's one of the variable ingredients that comes up over and over again in the Proverbs. How am I using my tongue? Am I using it to build or to destroy? And it's not always a time to build. Well, Solomon's going to say there is a time to build and there's a time to destroy. It's knowing when. And the wisdom of God is what helps me understand when it's a fit time to build up and when it's a time to do something else, right? And so ultimately, it's not just the way that I speak, but it's the way that I hear that can inform me. Because there are times in life where we say life comes at you fast. I can read the Bible all I want, but there's only so much of it I'm going to retain. And so God may bring a subtle word to me about what parts of the word I need to be emphasizing right now if I can listen to even the little children. See, they might not be Bible scholars, but they are kindness scholars in some ways. You don't have to wait to a certain age to understand human decency. And sometimes they can help us refocus all our head knowledge into a tone that's more appropriate if we're willing to listen. That's one of those other ingredients that Solomon is going to mention. And then diligence. Diligence is something that's going to come up over and over again in these Proverbs. And so as I was listening, I was driving to an event last night, and coming back, and on my way back, I was like, oh, let me listen to some of these Proverbs. I was listening. They were coming to me like a fire hose. I was like, okay, that's that. But five Proverbs later, I was forgetting what I just heard. But understand over and over again, they're going to reach you in a different place. And if you just look at them, they're going to look like they're just shotgun, right? Just scattered wisdom. But then over and over, you'll start to see some patterns emerge that may help you tune in to what the proverb writer is saying as we go further and further in the wisdom that he is offering us. Let's just look at Proverbs 12 to see some of these examples where I think all 5 of these come up. First of all, you back up to Proverbs 12 and you look at verse 23. Sorry, I got the wrong one. No, I'm in Proverbs 10 there. If you look at Proverbs 12, you look at verse 26. Verse 26. One who is righteous, literally righteous, is a guide to his neighbor, but the way of the wicked leads them astray. Reminding us, we don't live unto ourselves, but even if we don't realize that we are a leader, we are leading in some way, not always observed. And so that's the danger in picking up bad habits. But that's also the good part about picking up habits that are healthy, is you are teaching in times when it doesn't even seem like it's any effort being put into it. You're just living out the example, and God willing, someone is picking up on it. So it's not always the negative side, the do nots. Sometimes it's when you get in the habit of doing kind things or being decent to people. It's simply an example that you don't have to work to set. People just pick it up. Beyond that, the wisdom. There's going to be three verses back to back, 15, 16, and 17 to deal with varying parts of wisdom. Let's look at 16 first. The vexation of the fool is known at once, but the prudent ignores an insult. It doesn't literally say wisdom there, but that's a bit of wisdom about, once again, the way we express what's on our hearts. Verse 15 though is literally going to talk about wisdom in a different context. The way of the fool is right in his own eyes, but the wise man listens to advice. It's combining those two concepts, the wisdom and then the listening, two recurring themes we'll see. And then finally, the way that I speak matters over and over to Solomon. Verse 17, whoever speaks truth gives honest evidence, but a false witness utters deceit. And so roughly, those are those five concepts. They're subtle, but the more you listen to them, and for me, I didn't see it. We talk about different styles of learning. I didn't see it till I saw it. I started putting little notes or R's every time I saw righteousness, and I started putting W's every time I saw a W, or saw wisdom. And over time, a pattern began to develop. And sometimes you have to realize in your own life, you may learn better in different ways. Sometimes you need both kinds of stimuli to make it stick. And for me, I didn't start seeing it until I started seeing it. As long as I was listening, I was getting a little bit. But in your own time of personal study, maybe it helps as you're listening, not just to listen, but note some things that you're seeing over and over again. There's some Bibles that can help you do that. One's called the Inductive Study Bible. You don't have to necessarily pick your own favorite version. It's just an approach that instead of having a commentary in the margins, you have somebody that helps you use some symbols because they've already done the studying, and they can help you see some things that scholars have already found recur over and over in some of these passages. But they say you're not stuck. Find your own. Read it for yourself. Mark it up because they can't live your life. And there are some things that you have been through that those scholars haven't. They're going to help you see even more the way that these themes recur and they're relevant to you and your family and the home that you all are trying to build, right? And so as you're studying, listening does one thing, but sometimes you're not going to catch it until you see it. And I didn't catch it until I saw it. But understand, as we go back to verse 1 of Proverbs 12, going to that whole concept of wisdom, one of those things that seems to be a component of a home that's building in a healthy direction is whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but he who hates reproof is stupid. And this is the way it hit me, rightly or wrongly. I found over time that I am at my best, we say, when I can listen, right? When I can realize that sometimes the biggest threat to my happiness is me, the man in the mirror. Okay, we've already talked about that. But what happens over time when I get to a place where I can no longer look in the mirror? I still have to be out around people. There's some parts of ministry I'm not very good at all. Sometimes I'll get calls to do things that just give me the chance to publicly embarrass myself all over again. And every now and again, one of those things I was driving to was one of those events. And then some friends are like, no, it's okay. And they didn't say it that way, but that's what it looked like to me. Like, no, that's not okay. And so over time, if I can't hear rebuke, my encouragers, they can't encourage me as much as they can if they know I'm on self-check. If they know they don't have to be the voice of reason, they can simply be the voice of encouragement that simply encourages me to go back and do it better next time. See, that takes the pressure off of them to have the intervention at a certain point. And it relieves the tension in the friendship. Meaning when I walk into the room, people don't have to walk on eggshells because they know that there are these sacred cows in my life that we just can't talk about because Marcus has a sore spot there. See, we all have sore spots, but what happens over time is if I can't listen to reproof, the number of those sore spots grows to the point where I simply can't be reasoned with. And my presence becomes oppressive. And so if I'm trying to build my own home, we all love affirmation. But guess what? Everybody else in the house needs affirmation too. And I talked last week about one of the things as you get older, it ain't pretty no more. It's pretty and peace. And can I just tell the truth? Can I be in an environment where I can legitimately speak about everything, the things you do well and the things that you don't, without having to feel that in telling the truth I've committed some sort of sin because there's no way I can state it delicately? Heard a preacher say it maybe months ago. There's no nice way you can say some things in certain environments. The pressure is always going to be on you to say it different when the bottom line is it just doesn't want to be heard. And so ultimately, I am at my best when I am empowering the encouragers in my life to stay encouragers, because they know all they have to do is encourage me, and I'm already wanting to fix it because I know the faces that I'm getting, I could be doing this better. And they don't have to fill that role in my life every time I walk in the house. And so that house can grow in a healthy direction, as opposed to having to be constantly revolving around my need for affirmation. It's tough because we all need pats on the back, right? It's a part of it. But God willing, my need for a pat on the back doesn't make the tone in my home oppressive. Moving on. Verse 2. A good man obtains favor from the Lord, but a man of evil desires he condemns. That favor thing is huge. Who can really call themselves good, right? I'll raise my hand. Good luck with that, right? love being here. I talked in the young people's class today, the young adults class today, about the honeymoon period in any relationship, right? Yeah, he said roughly it's 6 months in a lot of places, especially in ministry. I start counting. Because ultimately there's a point where just like it says here, nobody's good, but there are some things that mark the life of an individual who's just trying, genuinely trying to get there. And even if it's not a place or a destination that we reach while we're still breathing, people can see the effort. They can see it in the way that, like we said, when you come into a room, they can speak honestly with you. It doesn't have to be candor all the time. It doesn't have to be just raw truth all the time, but there's a place for it because they know you're trying to genuinely get better, as opposed to trying to build some kind of kingdom here on earth that feels heaven-like, but it never really gets there. Why? Because the thing that Solomon is going to develop over and over again in the Proverbs is the temporary nature of any kingdom that I can build here. There is no country you can make me king or president of that will endure with the kind of stability that God can give me as a janitor, with peace in my home, with the ability to simply speak truth to my wife, with the ability to simply fill in the blank. And that's why some of these proverbs say, from the mouth of the king, better is a little with peace and quiet than feasting with turmoil. It's one thing for a poor guy to say it. There's a rich guy who gets it. And he's saying, if I am building the kind of stability that I want in my home, then ultimately I might not be perfect. I might have strayed from God. I might have the 1,000 wives now. But one thing I can at least do is the same thing that at least the rich man did from Hades and the rich man and Lazarus. I can at least have the heart to warn people while I still have time here. And God willing, I will have enough goodness in my character to not only try to point people to the bright sides of the things that I want to see, but the ways in which you might want to go a different direction, right? Because these are the things that I'm having to overcome in trying to build my own happiness that God willing you won't have to go through. The other side of that is when you reach a point where it doesn't matter what I say about myself, but if God recognizes me as a person who is literally trying to reach good, that whole concept of favor is huge, because I don't have to reach perspective for him to allow things to fall into place for me, things that I can't control, things that are trying to build that kingdom. Like I say from time to time, I can't control the weather. I can't control the traffic. I mean, I can with an accident, but that's just destructive. I can't make the lanes of life just open up and flow freely, but he can. And that's the difference between a life where I'm preoccupied with my image and my character. Because when I become preoccupied with my character, what he's saying is I don't have to become perfect. God begins to open up the lanes in my life so that they flow in ways that I can't on my own. It's a thing we talk about all the time. But it's one that is coming up again. Why? Because as we continue to go forward in the Proverbs, Solomon is bringing it up again. There's an endurance to the favor that comes from God that will never come with the kingdoms that I try to set up for myself. Well, I had a problem with verse 3. No one is established by wickedness, but the root of the righteous will never be moved. Really? Because see, there's some things in life where when I think I'm doing well, we call them self-fulfilling prophecies. Don't be surprised in life when you're doing really well, and sometimes you're people who aren't so encouraged by your success will begin to create environments where it looks like Is this really succeeding? You sure? It's like failure to me. And I remember a conversation I had with a young brother not too long ago. We talked about being really good at a sport and it having some negative repercussions in his own locker room. And that spoke to me, not to put that brother on blast. Because I've seen times in life where if you work in an organization and you're just a fly on the wall, you will see the way in which one of the reasons why I speak about David so much is that's the thing that stuck in his story the most to me after I grew up a little bit beyond the rocks and the slings. And I started having the chance to have just a little bit of success. And all my expectations about what success would look like, they just fell in the face of reality. See, I expected all the arrows to come from outside. But then I realized that there's this repeating pattern in life where when you have success in new environments, sometimes the arrows that catch you most off guard are the ones that come from what we would call friendly fire. And so people on your team who otherwise you would think we're all trying to win, right? This is a sport. Our win-loss record is what really matters. It's the reason why you see teams working so hard to build chemistry in professional sports. It's why you see players as great as LeBron James hopping from city to city to city to find the right chemistry. It's because there are times when the internal friction that comes because somebody might not be quite as happy about LeBron scoring 30 makes, for whatever reason, the team losing seem like a better option than another night of LeBron scoring 30. I'm not a LeBron fan, but that's the way teams work. And what Solomon is helping us understand is the more you realize that building a home that's healthy means you have to be prepared for all kinds of responses to your success. It means that I don't get into a mindset that every time I start getting arrows from an internal source, that now I go into fight mode. See, I can continue to build in a healthy way if I can catch arrows and do what I heard another preacher say. If I can recycle toxicity into something healthy. So what's happening is, what he's saying is, Solomon, from the time he started this kingdom, not everybody was like, oh, he's the boy king. Let's make him king. Isn't it cute? He's a boy king. No, his own brother didn't want him to be king. We've talked about that before. And so he's speaking from experience because the more you know his story, the more you realize that he's not just making things up. His life from the very beginning had to deal with not just internal arrows from Israel. It had to do with internal arrows from his own family and arrows from his own dad's trusted advisors. See, because even the advisors that David could trust, even the ones that stuck with him through the rebellion of Absalom, turned on his son when it was his son's time to take the baton. And so he's speaking from experience. And so understand, how is he going to continue to build the kingdom if he's simply drawn into a tit for tat kind of, you did me wrong, so I'm going to get back at you? Once again, we said he can't build if he's focused on getting even. And once again, these are themes I talk about from time to time. So like I said, I try not to allow the sermon to get bogged down into what I'm going through. But the reason why we're here is we're on another 7 chapters, and Solomon is bringing it up again. And so sometimes these themes repeat because it's just like when we use athletic metaphors. Sometimes it's one thing that he can drop as a nugget, and you can put it up on your shelf, and it'll just be there forever, kind of like you frame it. But some of these lessons he's saying you need to become conditioned to deal with over and over again. And so when over and over again he's talking about the same way his dad did, about the arrows that catch him by surprise, he's helping us understand not only how to deal with the hurt of betrayal, but how to continue to grow your house, to pursue happiness in a way that doesn't get you sidetracked. And that's not something you can put up on a wall because those are wounds that still hurt afresh every time they happen if you keep living and you're not used to having to overcome it. And so when he's talking about building a house or the wise build their homes, the wise are those who don't get caught up in the need, once again, to retaliate. And once again, they're going through it in a way that, like we said, some of the reasons why I get to points where I have rough weeks is it's the accumulation of stress. It's not one week where it's happened. But Paul says, run with endurance the race that is set before you. See, I hate the exhaustion part of endurance. I hate the redundant part of endurance. But over time, I had to get some tests done recently. I asked for prayers for the blood work. But there's some things that are okay. Some things that are like, that's evidence of somebody who runs a little bit. I talked about all my stupid experiments with running, right? Thinking that running on a treadmill equate to being able to run outside. Thinking that running at a low altitude in Houston is going to make me equipped to run at the higher altitudes up here. But all that folly I had over the years, stumbling and starting again with running, when a doctor's got to hook you up to a machine, and the truth is what it is, God willing, some of that proves itself over time. And so when the redundancy kicks in and you feel the exhaustion, understand that in the exhaustion, God is helping you to build a home that beyond what I say about myself, I can tell you I'm a runner, but then when you hook me up to a machine, that's when you actually know. And I'll understand, I can be as popular or as unpopular as I can amongst people. When God comes to visit us in those times of difficulty, that's like hooking you up to the machine. And so ultimately, when we talk once again about that whole concept of these parables, a lot of these themes are recurring because he's emphasizing the ones that you need to run over and over again, even to the point of exhaustion. Because at the point of exhaustion, that's when you're building up a level of character and a level of skill that you don't necessarily understand how well it's creating stability in your home. And here's the thing with David. Yeah, David died. He literally says that in the Acts 2 sermon. And so when it's talking about in verse 3, no one is established by wickedness, but the root of the righteous will never be moved. What are you talking about? David's dead. Sorry. Yeah, David's dead, but his legacy lives on in some very real ways, right? It's that whole concept of the Christ. And so it's not just something that we say on Easter or different holidays. But if you really understand what that means, it didn't just go from David to the Christ and now we just sing his praises every Sunday. There were some things that God saw in that person when he hooked him up to the machine that said, these are things that I want to endure in my nation or in the households that I'm going to set up forever, as opposed to things I just want to get rid of. And so when you see that David is dead, by the time that David died, there are some principles that lived on through his kids that you are never going to get rid of. Why? Because they weren't about David. They were simply things that David picked up from God. And over time, they became habits to the point where David being dead, meaning his kids didn't need to hear him in their ear anymore. There might have been some that strayed, but there was still a Solomon. And after a Solomon, there might have be a Rehoboam who fell, but Rehoboam got up. And ultimately, the thing that doesn't die is the part that God's willing to preserve. That goes back to his favor. That's why it's so important when God actually hooks you up to a machine, no matter what your self-esteem says, because sometimes your self-esteem is going to tell you you're less than what you really are. The good news in this is there are times when God puts you under stress and your perception of yourself or your popular perception is way lower than what God actually thinks of you. See, those are the times when it becomes easier to preach because that is good news. See, there's sometimes when I hear the gospel and people are talking about the good news, and I go like, well, where's the good news in that? I look at my own preaching sometimes, and I think, where's the good news in that? But I know what it's like to have low self-esteem and have God simply give me a moment where he gives me an evaluation, and it ain't all bad. And so that's what the endurance is about. See, there are times when you're going through it. You're hurting. You don't want to continue going on. But he's building in you a level of character that when everything around you begins to fail, he's ready, straight-faced, to tell you, well done, my good and faithful servant. In times when I just feel like I'm not much at all. Going on maybe to verse 7. The wicked are overthrown and are no more, but the house of the righteous will stand. That's that whole concept of, once again, endurance. Ultimately, it can look like, if you go back to that concept of the root, the thing that doesn't fade away is the root. But there are branches that can be pruned. The word literally says God himself prunes off the dead parts so that what's healthy can grow. And ultimately, there are times when the thing that's pruned is the life in general. Can't promise I'll be here tomorrow, right? None of us can. But the bottom line is that whole concept of what God is establishing is the root. It's what existed before you were here from the previous generation that you are carrying forward in a way that God would want to show favor. Why? Because the other side of favor is the favor that comes from man. And the trap that I can get into when I'm trying to build my own home and I'm trying to pursue happiness in my own way is I can seek the favor of man. We talked about it before. We all have bosses in one way or another. But the favor of man is a trap. if I end up getting into a situation where my money's coming in good because the boss loves me, ultimately, though, I'm stuck with the boss's standards. And there are times when I think God's standards are a little bit too high. Oh, but getting to a place where you have to become a people pleaser to keep your money flowing in. And you'll start to understand how repressive the favor of man can be. And God will start looking like a whole lot better boss than some of the folks we realize, I don't completely agree with what they're saying, but they're signing the checks. See, we make the mistake of thinking that we are, I've said it before, free agents. But the Bible describes us as in the middle of a war between two powers that are always going to be greater and tougher than any of us. Bob Dylan had a song. You're going to serve somebody. It may be the devil, it may be the Lord, but you're going to serve somebody. And sometimes that somebody comes in the form of a boss, or like we say, a social institution or a network we want to become a part of. And because we hate what God is telling us so much, we run like the prodigal to those people who can give us favor or money or whatever it is that we're craving, until we get a real good look of what it looks like in that alternative morality that we seem to crave. And you realize that some systems that you get into, you can't easily get out of. Because ultimately, when God gave us the 10 Commandments, they seemed oppressive, which is why Israel's like, oh, what else is going on? When Christ came forward and he modified that to the law of love, it still seemed too cumbersome. But sometimes we get baited into running to an alternative without thinking it through. When I'm looking to an alternative to Christ's law of love, what does it really look like to live under the full breath of kissing up to this power structure, of trying to appeal to this one? Because you're going to trade off something for whatever you're giving up in what you think Christ is asking you to do. Ultimately, going on, promise there's an end. If you go down to verse 19, truthful lips endure forever, but a lying tongue is but for a moment. That goes into that same concept that we talked about before. To the degree that I sell truth in order to have a smoother run for my livelihood, I find it easier to build my home shaving off pieces of the truth, as I say from time to time, using this table as an example of the way we can shave off pieces of truth. To the degree I sell the truth, I'm stuck with that fraction of it that I've sold. It's one of the reasons why one of these other proverbs is going to say, buy the truth and don't sell it. It's because ultimately, probably could do with an example right now. Young people ask me for some examples of what it was like when I was overseas as a missionary. And I told them about a time when things started to go a little bit rougher after that honeymoon period. And I told you previously about the fact that a lot of folks over there live on $1 or $2 a day. And ultimately, some of the students at the school we were teaching at were being given an option. They had been kept in a period of deprivation where the money that was supposed to go for their basic needs wasn't going there. So someone showed up who finally was bringing the money that they should have had for just basic things like soap and deodorant and food that was better than the food they were eating. They showed up with the money, but they also showed up with a deal. So it's one thing if folks are simply offering you out of the kindness of your heart things they know you need in a time that you're desperate. But sometimes folks will come up with that money that they know you need because they actually knew you were desperate and there's something they wanted from you. And so instead of simply helping you out, they're asking you to trade parts of your character for that thing, that basic necessity that they were holding out on all along. And so you have to be very careful in your times of desperation. When people know that you want all the nicer things in life. See, that illustration from the mission field is really similar to something I told them that law firms run on, a game their law firms run on their new associates. See, when they know you're fresh out of law school, typically laden with debt if you didn't have a full ride, they see you working next to these partners who have multiple nice cars, probably more than one home. A lot of the trappings of 20 years of success in the practice. And what they do is they encourage you to, as much as you can, keep up with the Joneses, even though you aren't making the same check that the partners are making. And ultimately, debt becomes a way in which they allow you to sign on to a lifestyle you can't afford. And after you sign on to a lifestyle that you can't afford, that's when the demands become a little bit more harsh, What was a request now becomes a command to compromise your integrity. And you no longer have the leverage to just say no. See, so it happens in the third world to people who operate or function on just $1 or $2 a day. But it's a game that's run in America and all over the world. Every day we go to work. And so what Solomon is saying is understand there's certain red flags for deals that you may want to pass on. Because ultimately when you're trying to build a home that is going to endure, that's not ultimately going to have a short shelf life, the shelf life of milk, as opposed to the shelf life of heaven, he's saying there's some things that you want to turn away from. And any deal that's charging you or challenging you to sell pieces of the truth in exchange for financial well-being or a little bit more progress when you don't really need the money especially, those are deals you might want to pass on. Going on to verse 21, we only got two more. No ill befalls the righteous, but the wicked are filled with trouble, which goes back to a verse that he uses in chapter 10, verse 22. In verse 22, it says, the blessing of the Lord makes rich, and he adds no sorrow with it. Understand that it's the opposite of the success we were talking about that comes with people pleasing. When God brings you into a period of success, sometimes he's going to ask you to wait on the front end. It's going to seem like, why am I waiting so long for this thing that's been on my heart? Like we said with the Moses thing, if it's not for me anymore, let me just go tend the sheep. But there are times when God leaves it on your heart because he has it for you. And the suffering is creating a greater peace or a greater sense of longevity than it would if you simply cut corners and take that deal. Understand, it's the same offer Jesus was given in the wilderness. Turn the stones to bread. Bow before me, and everything you're waiting on, everything you know is at the other end of that cross, becomes without the cross. It's the same offer we still get. Eve, take the fruit, whatever it was. God, he's got you on a performance plan. You don't need a performance plan. All you got to do is take a bite. It's the shortcuts in life that don't necessarily come to us in a time when we're full, but it's times when the enemy or life has dragged us out into places of endurance that the enemy then comes and offers us that shortcut. And so what he's saying is those shortcuts always come with a time stamp that doesn't come with the blessings of God. Because once again, he says, no ill befalls the righteous, but the wicked are filled with trouble. And so understand, I realized that in building my own success and all my adventures and trying to do it my way in the working world, there were times in life when I was trying to conceal the pain that was actually going on in my home because I didn't want people to understand what I was really going through. Because some of the things I was going through were tied to things that I had done wrong. And so what I eventually began to realize is when God added the success, he added it in a way where I could hold my head up. Why? Because the things that I was enduring and I was going through, they were things that I didn't have to be ashamed of. I didn't have to pretend. I could openly talk about the difficulties that I was going through. I didn't have to pretend in my mind that my suffering was completely separated from some things I probably could have done better. And so it came with a peace of mind. And like we said, as the CEO with hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions in my bank account, I may not have as much as I could have as the janitor who can simply hold his head up and walk into a home where he's encouraged to simply have peace. Why do I say that? Somebody asked me one time who my hero was. My hero in life is my grandfather. He was a janitor. So that's why I mentioned that. It's because just like David is writing these Proverbs from the perspective of a life that Solomon's writing these Proverbs from the perspective of a life that he actually lived. My grandfather made mistakes, but I saw him able to live with a level of integrity that through all of the difficulty allowed him to hold his head up in situations where folks who I've worked with in the firm can't. I'm going to tell you another anecdote as I start to shut up. I had somebody who pulled me aside one time at a big office. It wasn't necessarily an office I was working at, but it was a place where they had the names of the partners of this organization up on the wall. And he said, Marcus, out of those 30 or so names, 20 or so names, 24, 25 names, only 4 of us are still working on our first marriage. Understand the cost of what this place is asking from you. And the reason why he took me to that place on the wall, and he showed me that wall, is because he saw me at the crux of a moral dilemma. He didn't have to do that for me. He didn't have to mentor me, but he chose to. And he said, sometimes in your mind, you've got it stuck that you're doing it all wrong. But what you're being asked to do is to conform to a system that is taking a cost or a toll on your family life that you better be sure you're willing to pay. And so when that man, who never went to church with me a day in my life, was encouraging me as a partner at a firm not to completely give up on some of these principles of integrity, then it comes full circle when I see Solomon over and over and over again, chapter 14, verse 1, saying, "The wisest of women builds her house, but folly with her own hands tears it down." That partner was helping me to understand that I can pursue happiness at that law firm one way, but there's a cost to making sure, there's a cost to ignoring integrity in the way that I go about building my house. And here's the thing. Not everybody who comes through these doors is a Christian. Some people don't name the name of Jesus at all, but they still have that level of wisdom about them. And they understand that when they find maybe a point in their life when they might want to consider God, that they want to come to a place where the people they are working around are still in touch with that level of wisdom too. See, they don't want to come out of the world into an organization that functions like the world. They want to come out of the world into an organization where they can hear that there is a way to live good and live good. Because everywhere else is giving them the option to do whatever they want in the pursuit of happiness. And so one of the reasons why I say that is we'll close out. Two more verses. Please indulge me. Two more verses. We'll come full circle with the last verse in the chapter, where it says, in verse 28 in chapter 12, "And the path of righteousness is life, and in its pathway there is no death." That skips ahead to what we talked about today. David's dead. A lot of his kids are dead. Christ was crucified on the cross. But the reason we're still here taking communion is because there's something that lived on in the legacy of Christ that no one will be able to shake. And it's the same thing. It's not just Jesus. Jesus could have just been Jesus. He didn't need any of us here as an expression of who he is. But he uses everybody in whom he chooses to send the Holy Spirit to indwell as some sort of manifestation of love that is unique. And here's the thing. Insofar as we are willing to build wisely, he's saying that ultimately, if you turn with me back to chapter 10, turn with me back to chapter 10. Verse 24. "What the wicked dreads will come upon him, but the desire of the righteous will be granted." What Jesus is saying is this is not some morbid set of do's and don'ts, but all of those things that are on your heart that seems like the poem goes, what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? What happens to disappointment over time? He's saying there's some things on your heart that he wants to fully express through you, that he will, like we said, make those lanes open up clear and straight. If you simply have the patience to take those deals that are offered to you in a point of desperation, when you think you've hoped long enough in God, but the things that God is telling you to do just don't make sense in your environment. He's saying that these bits of wisdom that we're getting from the commandments handed down from Moses, now living on through the Psalms that we saw in David, now once again being repeated in the Proverbs of Solomon. If you, on your own time, read through these, because there's no way that I can read through the Proverbs that are going to speak most to you. But understand that in building your home, if you can just keep these three things in mind, God is always concerned about righteousness as opposed to the fruits or the success that we can come through cutting corners and doing shady things. He's always concerned about us pursuing wisdom. It's like in class, there's some mandatory requirements, core requirements that our teachers understand children have to learn. But then there's some electives, some things that those children do in their personal time that make the difference between success and failure. And the kids who tend to excel, just in my experience, are the ones who don't simply focus on the core requirements, but they go beyond quote-unquote righteousness to want to understand wisdom. And once you see a kid who has not only a drive to master the core requirements, but the drive to use his personal time to develop wisdom, that's why he's saying the sauce is going to taste a little bit better with that kid who's got not just salt, he's got salt and a little bit of garlic in what he's doing. And beyond that, he wouldn't just want to be wise. He wants to understand that likewise, I gotta have some diligence in what I'm doing. And so it's one thing for me to just build my own household, but like we said before, when I use my mouth to encourage the people around me, sometimes I'm starting to see those are situations in which God is willing to bless me even more. Because he sees it's not just me trying to pursue happiness for me. He sees me as a person who is encouraging other people to reach a higher level of happiness that goes beyond good and wrong or right and wrong and righteousness, but it's encouraging them to pursue wisdom on their own time too. Oh, and that's when things start to make sense. That's when no matter what's going on around me, no matter how many times I might lose a job, let's talk about that. That's the reality of what happens sometimes. You stand up for truth long enough on some of these jobs, you won't have them for very long. And one of the prison bars of this work environment is my fear of losing what I've got. That's one of the ways they keep us enslaved to the alternatives that God has to offer. See, if I'm not willing to lose it, then I can't find out what better thing God might have for me. And so ultimately, if I'm willing to tell the truth, even if, like you said, we had Christ as an example. Brother Joe said this morning, we were meeting back there. All the things we've done are nothing in comparison to what Christ went through. He was willing to lose his life. Am I willing to lose my job? Not just for random things. But once I put it through the filter of me being angry and seeing the Proverbs, and now I've got it in the filter of, okay, this is what needs to be said. Am I still trying to lock pieces off of the truth once it's no longer about anger, and it's just about me doing what God has called me to do? Do I give him a chance to replace what man has put in my hand? And so once I decided that I at least want to conquer that fear, I realized that I don't have to fight that battle on my own. Because when I'm in those lonely places of the cave, sometimes that's when God shows up. I heard another preacher preaching this morning. I will shut up after this. He was talking about how, no, it was a song. And, I get on the music every now and again. He was talking about God over and over has been my fourth man in the fire. My fourth man in the fire. Drawing on that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego example of when they tried to burn them for clinging to the truth, they didn't die. There was one more person who showed up in the fire with them. I'm going to tell you what preacher mind said. My carnal preacher mind said, I ain't seen that. That hadn't happened in my life. And Jesus' mind immediately kicked in and said, well, have you been willing to step into the fire? Ow! I haven't been places where I tested him to show up in that way. And so I want to blame him for not walking with me in fire. Well, I've been in the flames. And so he's saying the house that he wants to build for you is going to take you through the flames if you're willing to go there. But don't expect him to show up in miraculous ways if you simply want the goods that people can give you. That's all I got to say. I want to be, hey, everybody, let's go eat and be happy. I don't want to be a downer, but I do want us to eat and be happy. Let me not make a joke about that. I told the young people in class today. They asked me happy questions today in class. I was like, y'all know what I'll do with it, right? Unfortunately, I will find a way to make it morbid. I apologize. As you study this week, after God willing, a great time of communing together, hopefully something from these verses will carry you forward into a place where you will embrace all parts of the struggle that go along with God helping you to build a house in the pursuit of happiness that really will endure no matter what hell sends against you, as we together stand and sing.